Imagine a world where you knew that you mattered and you belonged. The people cared about you because we were so darn good at listening to one another, no matter how different we are. That is what Sidewalk Talk is doing by putting listeners on sidewalks all over the world so that we can practice the art of connecting. Join me, founder and director Traci, as I interview experts on the fine art of human connection and interview some of our volunteers who've been listening on the sidewalk and even some of the folks that we've listened to. And if you want to volunteer, consider joining us at sidewalk-talk.org. Today we welcome David Kessler. Now, David is the world's foremost expert on healing and loss. And he has written many books on the subject. One I know that you know, On Grief and Grieving. You know the 5 stages of grief? He was one of the co-creators of that. It's considered the Bible on the subject, and he co-wrote it with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. He now has a new book that we're going to talk about today called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief, and he extends the well-known 5 stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, that you all know, and adds meaning to it, because his own journey with grief started not only when he was a kid, when he witnessed mass shootings, but more recently, his life has been turned upside down by the sudden death of his 21-year-old son. So I'm really excited to bring to you the generous heart and wisdom of David Kessler. David Kessler, it is an honor to get to be in dialogue with you and just to feel and hear how much you've been of service for so many years around the topic of grief in really profound ways. You know, you've worked alongside one of my heroes, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. How did you start really becoming a thanatologist, somebody who studies death?
Well, I always say that it's not a profession. Sometimes you choose, sometimes it chooses you.
Okay.
And when I was 13 years old, I had a mother who was dying in a hospital, and it was a very sterile ICU environment. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the hotel across the street where we were, a fire turned out to be a mass shooting, and it was one of the first mass shootings in the U.S. So at an early age, I had a mother who died and a mass shooting, so it sort of engaged me in the grief world very early on.
So when you went on to graduate school and undergrad and grad, did you know that this is where you were already heading? I mean, was this
Not at all, not at all. I kind of, in some ways, I resisted it. But it turned out, I kept coming back to it, and it kept being the place where I connected with people. Mm. So it is what I ended up doing. Finally, I realized, you should do what you're drawn to and what you're good at.
Yeah, yeah. So you have worked hand in hand with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross. What was it like being a co-conspirator with her and being a part of the 5 stages? And tell me a little bit about how the two of you came together.
She was an amazing, organic, rule-breaking woman. And as you mentioned, she identified the stages of dying: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And other people began to sort of adapt and misadapt them for grief. And so her and I had written a book called Life Lessons. So we decided to follow up and formally adapt her stages for grief. And we did that in our book On Grief and Grieving. And I always remind people, literally on page 1, it says, they're not a map for grief. They don't have to go in that order. Your grief is very unique. And it's interesting in our modern world how people have turned them sort of into 5 easy steps for grief. Mm-hmm. And anyone who's dealt with grief and loss knows it's not 5 easy steps. And Elisabeth would sort of be appalled by how sort of rigid they've become, because that was certainly never our intention. And I find it interesting sometimes on social media, on my Facebook or Instagram, someone will post something like, "You and Elisabeth are just trying to neaten up our grief and make us follow rules." And that is the furthest who she is, and furthest who I am also. But I know we have an age that we want to simplify everything.
Yeah. I love that you're bringing that awareness and context and, in a way, freeing us all. Have you seen that one? There is one beautiful post, though, that models what you're saying. It takes her state, the stages of grief that the two of you created. And rather than it going from one to another, it's a squiggly line going like a big saying, you go through all of them all over the place in a really weird way. And it's I think you would really enjoy it.
Oh, I don't know if I've seen that. So if you see it again, send it to me. I'd love to see it.
I will do that. I will do that. You know, in your new book, which I've had the chance to look through, and I am going to be really transparent. I just lost my mother in August, so I'm having my own experience with grief. You felt the need to update the 5 stages and talk about meaning. And why was that important to add that last piece? Why was that missing?
Well, it connects with what we said about the stages being misinterpreted. One of the other big misinterpretations was that acceptance took on a finality that Elisabeth and I never intended.
Mm.
You know, when people ask, how long will I grieve, or how long will my friend grieve? I always say the question really is, you know, how long is a person going to be dead? Because if they're going to be dead a long time, you're going to grieve a long time.
Yeah.
But you can grieve eventually with more love than pain.
Mm.
So I thought about there's more than acceptance, and I was so curious about meaning and had written a good bit about it. Then a few years ago, my own son, David, my younger son, 21 years old, died accidentally. And obviously it was so brutal. And I kept looking and I thought, I need more than acceptance. I just don't want to let acceptance be all there is.
Mm.
So I thought, I want to learn about meaning even more.
Mm.
And so I interviewed people whose spouses had died and parents had died and children had died and siblings had died, all who found amazing meaning.
Mm.
And then I did the brain research on how our brain works in grief. And I wanted to put that together, and how our brain also makes up negative stories about self-blame.
Mm.
So that all became Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief, which is the new book. And I was just so honored that the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross family and foundation gave me permission to actually add a 6th stage to her iconic stages.
Yeah, wow. So they really sanctioned this to really transform those stages. It's so beautiful, David. What an honor.
I was honored by them. Thank you.
I also hear the motivation. I'm going to say something tender to you, that there's a way in which this honors your son as well.
Well, it is my finding meaning that, you know, part of what we find in meaning, when people first hear this concept of meaning, they go, there's no meaning in the death.
Mm.
No, there isn't, but there is meaning in the life we had with them.
Mm.
And there is meaning in our life after their death.
Mm.
And so for me, this book is a way that I find meaning in honoring his life, in a way he gets to be a helper in death he didn't get to be in life that he wanted.
Mm.
And, you know, so many people also think, oh, meaning, does that mean I'm going to have to start a charity or a foundation? And I tell people that meaning occurs in moments.
Mm.
That, you know, to identify those meaningful moments that we had with our loved ones, that honor our loved ones, that we can do to bring their life forward as we go forward in our life.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I think that's so clarifying what you're saying, that meaning is not this grandiose sort of display. It can be really simple, but I am almost hearing, you know, I've certainly met people, and I've certainly been one of these people who has gotten stuck in my grief. And I also imagine meaning helps some of that energy too. But tell us more about what happens when we get a little stuck there.
Sure, and I think we've all either been there or know someone. And grief is ever changing. We have a bad day, a worse day, a better month, a worse month. But like you mentioned, we've met people or been there where it doesn't feel like it's flowing anymore, and we're in the same place. And in some ways, when we become stuck, the loss becomes our focus, and we become dedicated to it. And meaning is a way that we can get moving again. And meaning certainly doesn't mean we're taking away the pain. I can't ever take away the pain of my son dying or your mother dying, but meaning can become a cushion that we can lean on. So meaning begins to help us and also help bring us out of that stuckness.
Yeah, I'm really feeling that as you say that. I think it's really cool the way you just said we can become dedicated to the grief. What is that? Can you expand on that? Because that's really profound what you just said there. What does that mean? Dedicated to the grief.
Well, that becomes when our life becomes not about life, but it becomes about the loss we suffered. And we see this all the time that, we have a choice. And I want people to know we have a choice, to not be a victim of it. So, for example, after my own son died, I remember, and I write about this, a woman, Diane Gray, who's a good friend of mine and was head of the Elisabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. And she also had a child who died too. She called me up and she said, David, I know you're drowning and you're going to be drowning for a while. But she said, at some point, you will hit bottom and you will have a decision to make. And the decision is, do you stay there or you begin to swim again? And that resonated as true. And I find that swimming again is the meaning we can find. And can we be present in our own life that honors their death versus being stuck in the loss around their death?
Yeah.
I can easily become someone who talks nothing except about my son's death. But my son was actually more than his death. And while I can talk about his death, I also want the focus to be his life.
Yeah. Well said. It really touches me. In your book, you make this distinction that sort of is a follow-on to what we're talking about here between pain versus suffering, which I imagine relates to this being dedicated to grief. What is the distinction? I think it's powerful for us to sort of sit with that a little bit, that you make between pain versus suffering when we're in a state of grief.
Sure. And one of the things I want to mention for anyone who's listening who may have other types of grief, I believe everything is the death of something. A breakup is the death of that relationship. A divorce is the death of the marriage. A job loss is the death of that work environment. So we feel pain after all these events.
Yeah.
And when a loved one dies or another loss occurs, we have the pain. And like I said, I can't take your pain away, nor would I want to. Your pain is part of the love. But suffering is what our crazy mind does. Our mind can't conceive of loss or death. So our mind often blames us, blames other people, makes a lot of noise, telling us we're always going to be in this pain. You would think our mind and our brain would be so compassionate to us after we've had a death. But it's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
And so for me, suffering is that noise, the commenting our mind makes in addition to the pain. So I can't take away anyone's pain, but I can help them with their suffering.
Oh, I think that is so helpful. So what I'm hearing you say is that we're going to have to really tend our mind or be prepared to. after
And that's
a
what I
grief.
try to do, right? And I try to sort of give people tips and techniques and to understand the brain science of the mind and why our mind does that so that we don't blame ourselves for blaming ourselves.
And speaking of, because I think what you're doing is something really generous with this book, and I told you, I think your website is so generous. You're doing something for folks that buy a copy of this book, Finding Meaning. You want to say a little bit about how you're
Sure.
supporting people that are suffering and in pain?
Well, I know that meaning and dealing with grief and loss is so hard to do. And how do we deal with the pain? So when I did this book, I thought I also want a companion class. So I have a companion class that anyone who gets the book, whether it's on Kindle or or audio or however form they get the book and wherever they get the book from, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, their indie bookstore, there's a free 7-module companion class that goes with it. And people can get the information for that at sixstage.com. SIXTH stage.com, or they can go to grief.com and they'll find it there.
I think that is such a supportive, generous offering. So thank you for sharing that with us here, for sure.
Of course.
You said something about grief and our mind, and so much of what we do at Sidewalk Talk is we're in relationship with others, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes some of the conversations that we have when people sit down with us are conversations about their grief. And I'm curious to hear, how are the relationships that we're in part of our journey of healing, of recovery, and how can we be good stewards when we're connecting with someone in grief?
Well, a few things I want to say about that. One of the things that I think harms us is that we have this idea when we die, all our relationships are going to be complete and tidy, and we've said everything we need to say, and we're going to just wrap everything up. And the truth is, we die in the middle of the argument. We die in the middle of the discussion. And so that reality happens and it catches us by surprise, but that's normal. And I always say, if there's something you need to say from your heart, if you say it in your heart, they'll still hear it in theirs. Now, in terms of connection after death, connecting with others is so healing. I have online groups at grief.com, and they're a nominal fee, but I never turn anyone away for lack of funds. And whether it's connecting online, connecting in a group, talking to others who have grieved, there's something about the social connection is so healing.
Are there things that when we're supporting someone that we should or shouldn't say?
Yeah, one of the things is part of our work is to witness people's grief, to just be with them.
Yeah.
We're fixers these days. We want to fix you. We want to show you the silver lining. We want to tell you, isn't it good that your loved one died quick, or the way they did, or isn't it a blessing? And I talk in the book about one of the rules of meaning is that your meaning is not a test or a blessing or a gift or a lesson. Your loss is loss. It's not a blessing that they died. It's not a gift the way they died. So sometimes our work is to just see them in their pain and be with them and not try to point out that silver lining, but just say, I don't know what this is like for you, but I'm here with you. And if you want to talk about it, I'm willing to listen. And then the challenge is, can we listen without fixing?
Yeah, that is a big challenge. We have some rituals when we're done listening to someone who might have shared something really heavy, and I'm curious how you hold space, David, for so many people that have wrestled with really hard things, especially because you've also experienced really hard things, and bounce back or maintain your vitality and aliveness without absorbing necessarily all of those experiences that person has shared. How do you take care of yourself there?
Well, I'll tell you, the truth is, we often talk about post-traumatic stress.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about bouncing back, the reality is post-traumatic growth is actually more common. And that's what I'm finding in meaning. And so what helps me is, because I tour all over the world, I'm excited to be going to 30 cities in the US, and I'm going to Australia, and I'm going to the UK. And you're right, I hear everyone's grief. But I recognize that's their grief. I can witness it, but it is not mine.
Mm-hmm. So that you have a certain kind of boundary then, it sounds like, in your listening.
Yeah, I don't take anyone else's grief on. I can cry with them. I can sit with them.
Yeah.
I can be compassionate with them.
Yeah.
And actually, me just witnessing their grief frees them and frees me. Me becoming an empath and jumping into their grief and telling them what their grief is like is actually a violation.
Mm-hmm. How is it comforting you when you're not entering into or jumping into their space? You said it's comforting when you don't do that. What about that's comforting to you?
Well, because I sit with them and I recognize how we're all together in this human experience.
Mm-hmm.
I tell people we come from a long line of dead people. Like literally all our ancestors died.
Right.
And so, the truth is we're a generation that feels like maybe death is optional. Mm-hmm. And death's taking us by surprise.
Yeah.
But we all sort of get humbled into this human connection with each other. And so there's just an X-ray vision you get when you've had grief that can allow you to just sit with someone else.
Mm.
That's comforting in the sense that it is part of this journey and it is part of healing. Mm. And for me, helping is healing.
So I'm really hearing that when you listen in a particular way where you're not entering into the other person's experience, but staying in your own with them, it deepens you into your own humanity in a very sweet way.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I really love that. So how is it that you have been a party to or in alignment with or met people like Joe Biden or Mother Teresa on this journey? How did that come about?
Mother Teresa was certainly an amazing gift to me that I went and volunteered in her home in Calcutta for the dying destitute. And got to meet her then. And then literally when she praised my first book, The Needs of the Dying, it sort of put me on the map. And, like it's Mother Teresa, so of course it would. And besides that, people like Joe Biden just were dealing with a loss and had read some of my stuff and felt moved to call me. And I'm always honored when people share their grief with me.
Mm. And I imagine that you do the same for them that you would do for anyone, which is you hold space and you bear witness, just like you've been saying, and help them reach a place of meaning.
Absolutely. Of course, we all talk about maybe the celebrities I work with and all that, but the truth is I can be in my hotel just when I'm around lecturing and, the maid sees a grief book and asks me what that's about. And, we end up talking about her dad who died. So, it's all around us. We don't often see it, but it is all around us.
What do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions you still have to combat in our culture about grief and about death? Sticking with
I think there's a 1 year myth that, after the year we're done grieving, it's all over.
Why a year? Who came up with that?
There was a sense, there was a positive thing about that year of mourning. There was a time that we would all wear black when we were in grief. And that was a good thing because you could see literally who was in grief. Mm. The downs end, when that year was up, no one ever said, now your grief is over. They just said you don't have to wear black anymore. Mm. But the grief continued, but they did say it 1 year, there is a permission to live again that you now have. And so we've lost that. We don't know how to identify people in grief. We don't know how to see each other's grief. And we don't know that grief continues on and that there is a point that it becomes okay to live again. And that living again isn't disloyalty to the people who have died. It actually honors them.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, there were some pluses and minuses
Right,
to this
exactly.
1 year piece.
Right.
Sometimes it was inhibiting, and in other ways it was liberating because it allowed
Right.
people to give you space. That makes sense. You know, I had a few friends share some excerpts from your book on social media prior to our call, and there was this piece around people bringing furniture out. And I believe it was
Yeah, you want to hear that story?
I do. Can you tell that for us?
Sure. So the story is when I was touring in Australia a few years ago, and I'm excited to be going back again to 5 cities. When I was in Australia, a researcher came up to me who was researching these little small villages in Australia and said how the night someone died, she was told that when someone died, everyone in their house in the small village had to move a piece of furniture, or they had to change something in their yard or outside their house or their apartment or whatever. And the researcher said, "Why do you do it?" And she said, "Because when the family wakes up the next morning, we want them to see that now that their loved one has died, everything has changed." And think about how different that is than our experience in Western society, where you get up the next day and nothing's changed, but your world has been shattered.
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking back too, David, I also lost 4 years ago my best friend to cancer. And the moments that I didn't like were the ones where I would forget that he was gone, and I'd pick up the phone to call him about something because everything looked the same.
Right,
you know?
right, of course.
And I think there's something beautiful about this story because not that that wouldn't happen anyway, but it creates this marker for the human psyche to tether itself to in a way to say, okay, it's different and it is going to be different.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I really love that. There's just so much richness here, and I'm feeling so profoundly grateful to get to be in dialogue with you about this. As you have counseled others, what was it like to be the one counseled? You went through this experience when you were young. Then you became really an expert in the field. And then you have to face this exact experience yourself.
Well, it was brutal. And, people would say, "Oh my goodness, what's it like for the grief expert?" And I would go, it wasn't the grief expert whose son died. It was the father who had to bury his son. So it was very, obviously, it was a personal experience. It was not a sort of work experience. The other thing is, I had to experience it like everyone else, and I did everything that I've told everyone else to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, though, it humbled me that when I went to a grief group, and I went to a grief group with a cap on, and my books were on a table, like literally 3 feet away,
Mm-hmm.
and like no one knew that was me. It was so hard to go, and I kept going, "The traffic's bad, I can't go." And then I couldn't find a parking place, I can't go. So it's sort of like now, because of that, when someone walks into a grief group or walks in to see their therapist, I'm much more aware of the courage it takes and the work just to get in the room. Because I think sometimes we forget how hard it is for people to show up for themselves. Because it was enormously hard for me to show up for myself. I wanted to run the other way.
Yeah. Well said. Yeah. I think that's why it's important that therapists go to therapy too. For the same reason.
Absolutely. And people have said to me, they're like, "Well, what did you do in grief counseling? I mean, what could someone possibly say?" And I was like, grief needs dedicated time.
Mm.
It was a dedicated time to my grief. It wasn't so much what was said or what wasn't said. It was a dedicated time to my grief.
It's another good one. There's writing all these great quotes down, David. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I just feel so excited to gain these tools. And I really do want to implore for all of our Sidewalk Talk listeners, I think it's imperative that we really spend some time with David's book, because we do listen to stories of grief. And there's one last question before I do our closing ritual, which is we also hear, and you alluded to this earlier, about non-death related grief. And we are hearing a ton about the environment right now. Lots of people sit down and talk about the environment, or they talk about politics. And there's this grieving, almost sense of futility. And I'm wondering if is public grief a real thing? Is this a legitimate thing to be grieving about? And are there differences?
Absolutely. Public and collective grief is very real. But one of the things we do is we see these things outside of ourselves. It's this public grief and no one's doing anything about it and all that. And just like I say with personal grief, I can't ever attend to someone else's grief. Grief is what we do on the inside. Mourning is what we do on the outside. So I can't ever go, I'm going to help someone grieve. I can't get into their heart and soul and help them grieve. The same is true with public and collective grief. There isn't a collective to say we've got to do something about grief, whether it's about politics or the environment or whatever it may be. You have to go, what am I going to do about this collective grief that's impacting me personally? What can I personally do about it? While it's collective, the action occurs individually.
So I'm almost hearing that you have to, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing you say, when stuff is big going on in the collective and you're having a grief response to it, you have to give it space, just like you'd said previously when someone dies. You have to do something for yourself internally to process that grief.
Right.
Is that right?
Right. And it takes us back to meaning. If I see a shooting on TV, and I'm just walking around going, these shootings are horrible and it's just so painful and there's a collective grief and I don't know what to do about these. And, this is just horrible. Period. Well, it just stays horrible. If I go, how can I make meaning out of this grief? Oh my gosh, the Red Cross is showing up. Let me give money. Oh my gosh, I have an issue with the mental health of these people. How can I help with mental health issues? Is there a mental health organization I can help with? Can I care more about that person down the street that I think is odd and I don't talk to them? How can I change? How can I make meaning? How do I feel about guns? Can I work with that? Can I donate money? What can we do when we see these collective things? What can you do with the environment? Can you volunteer to pick up trash? Can you give to an organization? Can you call your congressperson? Because when we take action, that is meaning. And then we're not a victim of our collective grief.
Well, you sure helped me understand. It was gun violence that had me start Sidewalk Talk. So it was that grief and gripping.
Well, there's your meaning. There's your meaning. You made meaning in starting Sidewalk Talk. Yeah. That is meaning making.
You helped me understand it a little more right now. So I appreciate that. So there are 7,000 people who sit out on sidewalks around the world that are listening to us dialogue right now. And I want to get out of the way here for a second as our closing ritual, David. And I would ask, what wish would you offer directly to them, or piece of wisdom do you want to offer as a way to close our time together?
Well, first of all, I hope get to meet them somewhere, maybe, whether it's in a retreat or a lecture or something, and maybe on the sidewalk. And my wish for them is wholeness. Part of my work is to help bring our whole self to our future, our whole self to our next relationships. Sometimes we bring our broken selves into the next relationship, into the next encounter, into the rest of our life. So my wish for them is to find their whole selves.
Beautiful. Thank you again. And how can people find you? We've talked about your book, but you have a website. Do you want to share a little bit about there?
It's grief.com. And as I mentioned, there's online classes on it, and they're nominally priced, but no one's turned away for lack of funds. I do retreats all over. Some of them, I have a few coming up for breakup, divorce, and betrayal. Anyone who's dealt with those know those are horrible griefs. I also have ones coming up around grief and loss of a loved one dying. I have one-day seminars all around the world, and I hope that people will go to grief.com, look at the events, and I would love to see them somewhere.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for all the work that you do in the world. You are a gift, David. And this book,
thank you.
I really want to pay homage to the inspiration of your son for bringing us all more meaning as we really make new meaning in our own lives with our own grief. So thank you to him too.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for being here and listening to this episode of the Sidewalk Talk podcast. If you like what you heard, tell your friends, tell your family, like and comment on the podcast publisher that you're listening from, and subscribe. This will help us get the word out about changing our culture to one of connection.